The glittering triumph of the Hope by Logan fashion show was supposed to be the defining moment of Hope Logan Spencer's career, a spectacular declaration of her independence and creative genius. The runway had been a dazzling spectacle of flashing cameras, thunderous applause, and international media frenzy, effectively eclipsing Eric Forrester's highly anticipated haute couture return. Katie Logan Spencer was reveling in the massive corporate victory, praising her own strategic brilliance as advance orders poured in. However, beneath the veneer of this unprecedented success, the newly crowned Queen of Logan Creations was quietly, desperately crumbling. The sheer magnitude of the event had demanded a physical and emotional toll that no human being could sustainably endure, setting the stage for a catastrophic breaking point. To understand the sheer magnitude of this physical and mental collapse, one must look at the impossible timeline dictated by Katie Logan. In her ruthless pursuit to blindside Forrester Creations and hijack the international press corps, Katie had imposed a deadline that defied logic and human endurance. For weeks, Hope had been trapped in a relentless pressure cooker, working alongside Deke Sharp around the clock. She had endured countless sleepless nights, surviving on a dangerous cocktail of caffeine, adrenaline, and sheer willpower. Every waking moment was consumed by sketching, fabric selection, fittings, and the agonizing stress of keeping the entire operation a closely guarded secret from her own family. The physical exhaustion had seeped into her very bones, leaving her a hollowed-out shell of the vibrant woman she once was. But the exhaustion was not merely physical. It was a soul-crushing psychological burden born from the ultimate betrayal. Hope's defection to Logan Creations was not just a business maneuver. It was a profound fracturing of her family's legacy. The weight of lying to Steffy Forrester Finnegan, Ridge Forrester, and Eric Forrester had been a heavy cross to bear. She had watched the live stream of Eric's press conference in horror as he aggressively accused Logan of stealing Forrester's thunder, forcing her to confront the catastrophic human cost of her ambition. The guilt of abandoning the Hope for the Future brand, the very empire she had built from the ground up, gnawed at her conscience, compounding the severe sleep deprivation until her mind began to fray at the edges. The true catalyst for her unraveling, however, was the devastating, volcanic wrath of her mother, Brooke Logan Forrester. The memory of their final confrontation was a deeply embedded trauma that Hope could not shake. She had publicly admitted to the press that Brooke knew nothing about the launch, a revelation that shattered her mother's heart and ignited a terrifying maternal rage. Hope was continually haunted by the mental image of Brooke aggressively confronting Katie at the Logan offices, violently smashing a monitor in a fit of uncontrollable fury. But the most agonizing blow was Brooke's devastating ultimatum, declaring she could no longer look at Hope the same way, culminating in the official eviction of Hope and Liam from the cabin on the Logan estate. The psychological trauma of being disowned by her own mother had completely shattered Hope's fragile mental state. Following the adrenaline-fueled high of the runway show and the subsequent media frenzy, the crash was brutal and unforgiving. The after-parties had faded, the reporters had dispersed, and Hope was finally left alone with the deafening silence of her own mind. Leaving the Logan Creations headquarters at the break of dawn, the contrast between her public triumph and her private agony was stark. The streets of Los Angeles were eerily quiet, bathed in the soft, deceptive light of early morning, offering a false sense of peace to a woman who was actively losing her grip on reality. Every step toward her car felt like wading through wet cement, her body screaming for the rest she had denied it for so many agonizing weeks. The drive from the Logan offices to the safety of the Spencer mansion should have been a routine, quiet journey, but for Hope, it quickly devolved into a waking nightmare. As she gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white with tension, her body began to shut down. Her eyelids felt like they were weighted with lead, fluttering shut for microseconds before she forced them open with sheer, panicked willpower. The blurred vision and delayed reflexes were dangerous enough, but the severe sleep deprivation and emotional trauma began to warp her reality, inducing terrifying, vivid hallucinations that hijacked her senses. As the miles stretched on, the psychological torment manifested into terrifying visual illusions. The rhythmic passing of the streetlights transformed into the blinding, aggressive flashes of paparazzi cameras, disorienting her and triggering a visceral panic. The shadows stretching across the empty highway morphed into the accusatory silhouettes of the Forrester family, pointing fingers and shouting words of betrayal. But the most horrifying hallucination of all was the phantom image of Brooke, her face contorted in absolute fury, appearing in the rear-view mirror. The boundary between the physical world and her fractured psyche completely dissolved, leaving Hope trapped in a terrifying echo chamber of her own guilt. The auditory hallucinations were just as vivid and punishing. Over the hum of the engine, Hope heard the sickening crack of Brooke's hand violently slapping Katie's cheek, a sound that reverberated through her skull like a gunshot. She heard the shattering of the monitor glass, followed by the cold, devastating echo of Brooke's voice. "I can no longer look at you the same way." The declaration of disownment looped endlessly in her mind, a torturous mantra that drowned out her own thoughts and overrode her basic survival instincts. The emotional pain was so acute, so entirely overwhelming, that it eclipsed the physical reality of navigating a multi-ton vehicle at high speeds. In the suffocating grip of this psychological torment, the physical limitations of her exhausted body finally took absolute control. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the impossible deadlines and the runway debut entirely evaporated, leaving a catastrophic void. For just a few fatal seconds, Hope's heavy eyelids surrendered, drooping shut as her mind plunged into darkness. The grip on the steering wheel loosened, and the vehicle, now unguided, began to drift dangerously out of its lane. It was a tragic, heartbreaking irony that in the very moment she had achieved her greatest professional dream, she had completely lost control of her own life. The transition from the eerie quiet of the early morning to the deafening roar of destruction was instantaneous and violent. The screech of tires tearing against the asphalt was a brief, desperate warning before the horrific impact. Hope's vehicle violently veered off the lane, careening with terrifying speed before smashing head-on into the unforgiving concrete divider. The visceral crunch of metal folding, the explosive deployment of the airbags, and the shattering of safety glass created a symphony of absolute devastation that violently shattered the peaceful dawn. The immediate aftermath of the collision was a chilling, ominous silence, broken only by the hiss of the ruptured radiator and the gentle crunch of settling debris. The wrecked car sat smoking in the early morning mist, a twisted, mangled monument to the devastating cost of the Forrester and Logan corporate war. Inside the crushed cabin, the brilliant designer who had just conquered the fashion world was reduced to a fragile, broken victim of her own ambition and her family's ruthless crossfire. The soaring victory of Logan Creations had instantly, brutally transformed into a horrifying medical nightmare. Miles away, a profound sense of unease had settled over Liam Spencer. A husband's intuition, sharpened by years of navigating the chaotic dramas of their lives, was screaming that something was terribly wrong. Liam knew intimately the terrifying toll this project had taken on Hope. He had been the one to frantically revive her when she suffered a severe panic attack and collapsed unconscious on the floor of the Logan Gallery just days prior. He knew she was pushing herself far beyond the brink of human endurance, and when she failed to return to the Spencer mansion after the launch, his protective instincts shifted into overdrive. Driven by a frantic, clawing desperation, Liam navigated the misty dawn streets of Los Angeles, retracing the route between Logan Creations and their home. His heart hammered against his ribs, a sickening dread pooling in his stomach with every passing mile. He prayed to any higher power that she was simply asleep at her desk, that the exhaustion had merely delayed her return. But as his headlights cut through the morning fog, illuminating the flashing hazard lights of a stationary vehicle in the distance, the bottom dropped out of his world. The moment Liam recognized the make and model of the mangled vehicle crushed against the concrete divider, his heart stopped. The sheer terror of seeing his wife's car reduced to a smoking pile of twisted metal paralyzed him for a fraction of a second before raw, primal adrenaline took over. He slammed on the brakes, throwing his own car into park before it had even fully stopped, and abandoned it in the middle of the road. His desperate sprint toward the wreckage was a blur of motion, his lungs burning as he closed the distance to the catastrophic scene. The scene that greeted him was ripped straight from his darkest, most paralyzing nightmares. The driver's side of the vehicle was heavily caved in, the windshield a spiderweb of shattered glass. Inside, slumped motionless against the deflated, blood-stained airbag, was Hope. The stark contrast between the glamorous, triumphant designer who had commanded the runway just hours ago and the broken, unconscious woman trapped in the wreckage was a visual that would haunt Liam for the rest of his life. His agonizing screams tore through the quiet morning, a visceral sound of pure heartbreak and terror as he reached through the shattered window. Adding a layer of profound, poetic tragedy to the gruesome scene was the fate of Hope's most prized possession. The thick, meticulously organized design portfolio, the very collection of sketches that had cost her countless sleepless nights, alienated her from her mother, and ultimately driven her to this catastrophic breaking point, had been violently ejected from the vehicle upon impact. The pages containing the brilliant Hope by Logan designs were now scattered across the cold asphalt, fluttering helplessly in the morning breeze, blown away like the fragile dreams they represented. It was a haunting metaphor for the fleeting, destructive nature of corporate ambition. Liam's desperate, agonizing screams echoed into the empty dawn as he frantically tried to rouse his unconscious wife, his trembling hands gently touching her face, terrified of causing further injury. He pleaded with her to open her eyes, to squeeze his hand, to give him any sign that she was still tethered to the living world. The sheer helplessness he felt in the face of this tragedy was crushing. He realized with sickening clarity that the ruthless corporate war between Katie and Steffy, and the unforgiving wrath of Brooke Logan, had demanded a terrifying blood sacrifice, and Hope was the one paying the ultimate price. As the distant, mournful wail of approaching sirens began to cut through the morning air, the stark reality of the situation settled in. The triumphant launch of Logan Creations was no longer a victory. It was the catalyst for a life-or-death struggle. The impending news of this horrific crash is destined to send shockwaves through the Forrester, Logan, and Spencer families. The crushing guilt that will inevitably consume Katie for her impossible deadlines, and Brooke for her devastating disownment, threatens to permanently alter the landscape of their lives. As paramedics rush to extract Hope from the twisted metal, the entire fashion world holds its breath, waiting to see if the brilliant designer will survive the nightmare born from her greatest success.